Welcome everyone to this webinar called The Impact of Unrestricted Funding. This webinar is part of our Funders Focus series. Every month, more or less, we organize a webinar on all kinds of different topics. And today we are going to talk about unrestricted funding with a very special guest speaker who will introduce herself very shortly. Before we're going to talk about this topic, just a few house rules. If you have participated in our webinars before, you know them already. But this webinar will be recorded, so also people that cannot join the webinar in a live setting will get the video afterwards, so they can watch it in their own time. You, of course, also get a recording of the video. If you don't want your face to be seen in the video, just make sure that your camera is not on and it will not be featured. Total webinar will take about an hour. 45 minutes of it will be a conversation between me and Pamela. And at the end, we will reserve some time for question and answer. So all of the questions you might have hopefully will be answered in the next hour. And the way we structure that is you can ask all your questions in the chat. So please do so now or at the end of the webinar. And our moderator of today, Kenneth van Tol, she will collect all the questions and make sure that they will be asked at the end. Good. Enough about this. Let's get started with the topic of today. And well, before we do that, it's good to have Pamela introduce herself. Pamela, you have a huge background and CV, so I thought it's most efficient if you introduce yourself. So who are you, where do you work, and why are you here?
Yeah, thanks so much, Han, for inviting me for this webinar, and welcome everyone. It's so excited to see you all here for a topic that I hold very dear and I think is extremely important. We talk more about unrestricted funding. So I'm Pamala Wiepking. I'm the Stead Family Chair in International Philanthropy at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy in Indianapolis in the US. But I'm actually based in the Netherlands. I work also at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, where I'm a professor of societal significance of charity lotteries. A professorship for one day in the week, which has been sponsored by the Dutch postcode lotteries, one of the largest institutional funders in the Netherlands. And why I'm interested in unrestricted funding is because with this chair, I started to think, okay, I have this position as a professor of the societal significance of charity lotteries, but how can we make this most interesting to everyone in the philanthropic sector and wider society? And very uniquely, the postcode lotteries who fund this chair have been giving unrestricted funding since 1989. And it turned out very little was known about the effectiveness of this type of funding. So that's what we started to study in 2019. And now 6 years along, we have some evidence I'm happy to share with you.
Excellent, excellent. And well, let's dive into that. But before we do that, one thing you didn't mention, and I do want to show it, but Pamela is also one of the editors of this amazing book, The Fundraising Reader, for everyone that wants to have everything you should know about fundraising in one book. This is highly recommended. Yeah, I think it's the most complete reader I've seen about fundraising in a very light and accessible way. So big compliments to you, Pamela, for that. But
thanks so much.
So today we talk about trust-based philanthropy, and actually the topic of the webinar we've called unrestricted funding. So an unrestricted funding, in my view, is probably the holy grail in fundraising. Over the last months, this is probably the question that has been asked to us the most. Where can we find it and how does it work? So you in your work talk a lot about trust-based philanthropy as well. And they are, of course, connected. But maybe before we go into the topic of unrestricted funding, what is it that you actually mean with trust-based philanthropy?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question and for highlighting my work on fundraising, which is a different research stream that I love working on. I love all fundraisers and helping them to get connected with this wide range of literature that's out there, but it's often behind paywalls as academic research is often not very accessible, unfortunately. But talking about trust-based philanthropy, I will share my screen with some slides to illustrate what I'm talking about. So can everyone see this correctly?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So when we talk about trust-based philanthropy, this is a funding philosophy where funders collaborate with grantee organizations or partners in a way that holds all partners accountable to each other. It aims to break the traditional power dynamics in the philanthropic sector, emphasizing equity and the achievement of common goals. Trust-based philanthropy responds to the needs of society rather than just what the funder thinks is important. Through learning, reciprocity, and transparency, philanthropic partners can tackle complex problems together. Organizations that operate based on the principles of trust-based philanthropy typically follow the following 6 guidelines. So first of all, and this is a really important guideline in trust-based philanthropy, the unrestricted funding, which will be a large part of our webinar today. But the other rules that the trust-based philanthropy initiative, you see the link at the bottom, came up with these ideas for how to practice this are that as a funder, you have to do your homework. You have to know what you're talking about and what the issues are so that it's not on the grantee, the recipient, to explain that to you all the time. It is really important to minimize application and reporting pressure, which is a huge issue in the philanthropic sector, as probably most people in the room will know. It is about being transparent and open, building those relationships with recipient organizations and being open to the feedback on your organization and acting on that feedback. And finally, it's important to not just provide resources in terms of money, but also open up your network, for example, so they can find other funders or share the successes of organizations to highlight what they've been doing and how they've been achieving their mission. So everything you can read about trust-based philanthropy on the website on this slide, and I highly encourage you to go there if you haven't visited yet.
Great. So before we dive deeper into this and the unrestricted funding, just out of curiosity, but what motivated you to dive into this?
Well, I already explained a little bit about the background of why we are studying this topic. It started when I was appointed as the full professor of societal significance of charity lotteries at the Vrije in Amsterdam. And then we really dove into studying these effects of unrestricted funding. And already very soon thereafter, we found out this is not just like one idea in funding. It's part of this trust-based philanthropy initiative with much more guidelines for funders, how you can create those more equitable ecosystem in which we all work. So we found that really important. And what I really think is important about it is a way to democratize philanthropy. So where typically there is this huge power imbalance between a funder and a grantee, but through unrestricted funding, trust-based philanthropy, other forms of more participatory grant making, you can really build more of a relationship between a funder and a partner. And most importantly, include the communities that this is all about, the communities and the people that you're trying to support to make sure that they actually have influence on decisions that have been made. And that way we can democratize philanthropy. And I feel philanthropy can be much more effective when we do that.
Wow. Yeah. All right. So the topic of the wording of unrestricted funding has been mentioned now a few times and seems to be part of trust-based philanthropy, but and before we explore it a bit, but what is it exactly that we mean or don't mean by the word of unrestricted funding?
Yes, thanks. I will share my screen again to show a few slides to show the background of this. So when we talk about trust-based philanthropy, one of the most important principles is unrestricted funding. But what is that exactly? First of all, flexible funding is funding where the recipient organization can determine to some extent what they do with the money they receive. And this can take various forms, such as completely unrestricted funds. So people may know, for example, Mackenzie Scott in the US for a few years now. She's been giving a lot of unrestricted funding, and there's no strings attached, as he says. A related form is focusing on strengthening organizations. So, for example, through core or organizational funding or capacity funding intended to support the organization itself. If you look at my next slide, it shows that unrestricted funding is not a dichotomy. So there are there's a fluctuation in the restrictiveness of funding. So on the left-hand side, you see the most restricted form of funding, which is typically project funding. And as we will see, most of the funding in the philanthropic ecosystem is restricted project funding. But if you move more to the right, you see, for example, there's unrestricted project funding. So this can be funding that an organization receives for one specific project, for example, to build a playground for kids, but they get this funding and can decide completely themselves how they will do it and a little bit more about the time frame in which they do it. So they have more flexibility in how they do that. Unrestricted program funding, for example, can be funding that an organization receives for all their projects around youth. So there's this program within an organization, and the funder gives the money to spend it all on that one program. And they can be flexible in how they decide what kind of projects they will fund. And on the completely right-hand side, you see unrestricted funding, where the receiving organization can completely decide for themselves how they will spend it, when they will spend it, on what they will spend it. And sometimes I call this like unicorn philanthropy, because it is not that common that organizations receive that type of funding. On the top of this figure, you also see core and organizational funding, also from the previous slide, and that can take different forms. In some cases, core or organizational funding is actually pretty restricted, because the funder says, well, you have to pay your upgrade your ICT system with it, or you have to use it to do specific capacity developments. So in that way, it's not that unrestricted, but core organizational funding can also be very unrestricted, where the organization has this money and can decide how to improve their organization themselves. So if we look at some recent numbers, these are numbers from the US, and the Center for Effective Philanthropy shows that in 2001, 61 of the 284 foundations they surveyed are providing some form of unrestricted funding. And at least 65% of those organizations plans to do this moving forward. This is the most recent data I have on the US, and it's a bit problematic because it is right in the middle of COVID. So during COVID, we saw this really encouraging trend of foundations loosening their grant requirements. So they were providing much more flexible funding, because they saw that if they didn't do that, the organizations could not address the issues that were arising due to these changing circumstances due to COVID. So I would be really curious to see what the numbers are actually now for the US, but unfortunately those data is not available. We do have some more recent data for the Netherlands. So if you look at the percentage of funding provided through project-based, you see that's 45 out of 58 organizations. So 92% of the organizations provide project-based funding. And 27 provide core funding, so almost half, and then 12 out of 58, which is 21%, provide unrestricted funding. So, and this is in 23. So this looks very promising, but then if you look at the actual amounts that those organizations spend on unrestricted funding, it is a bit disheartening, because here you can see that only 4% of the actual amounts given to organizations are unrestricted. 14% core organizational funding, and 97% is project-based funding. So most money in the Netherlands is very much restricted project-based. And we have indications that in many other countries this is very similar, but unfortunately there are not a lot of hard data on this. So let me stop sharing my screen so we can discuss some other topics.
Yeah, so it's only a small percentage, and that's probably why everyone is seeking for it so much, because there are not so many, or the amounts are not so high, at least that is fully unrestricted. And although I fully understand why it's so great to get unrestricted funding, because it's so much easier than restricted funding. Why is it so important to receive or give unrestricted funding?
Yeah, so it's important for many reasons, and I should have kept my slides up because these are two more important slides I want to share about this. So the first one is about the nonprofit starvation cycle. So maybe some of you have heard about this. The nonprofit starvation cycle states that funders have unrealistic expectations about projects' cost. Organizations, the receiving organizations, want to try to keep these funders satisfied. And as a consequence, the organizations spend too little on overhead costs and underreport the real cost for projects. And that leads organizations to enter this nonprofit starvation cycle where they slowly don't have enough funding to survive. So this is a well-documented process in the nonprofit sector, and there's a lot of issues with this. And one of the issues that fundraising organizations can address is to actually budget realistic projects, like budget in all your organizational core overhead costs when you apply for funding. And then have this conversation with funders explaining why you're doing that and making it explicit. And I know it's not a popular stance on this, but I think we need to break this cycle and we need to be honest about what it costs to run certain projects. Unrestricted funding is like a savior for these organizations because they can use that freely available flexible money to support the gaps they have through to those lower budgets for their projects. So when we did interviews in the Netherlands, we learned a lot about, for example, EU funding not being sufficient for a lot of organizations to actually run the project. So they actually needed unrestricted funding, for example, from the postcode lottery, to be able to conduct those EU-funded projects. So it is really important. Also, institutional funders need to be aware of these issues and fund the real cost of projects. The other reason why unrestricted funding is really important is because it really helps organizations build their capacities. This is a slide from an article that I published with my colleague Arjen de Wit. And on the right top hand side, you see a QR code with a link to a practitioner summary. And the bottom right, you see the full journal article, which is open access. So everyone should be able to access it. And what we studied in this paper is to see how gradations of unrestricted funding can actually help to improve and build nonprofit capacities. And we were not able to test the full model, and we're working on that, but it's of course very complex. But our argument is that when you increase these nonprofit capacities, you also increase nonprofit effectiveness. How effective organizations are working towards their mission, how well they are helping those people and communities that they're trying to support. And if we talk about these capacities that are supported by unrestricted funding, the most important, of course, is financial management, the financial stability of an organization. Or you may notice that we also put a minus sign there. So that we put that there because from our interviews, we learned that if a nonprofit organization only receives unrestricted funding from one funder, for example, they become very dependent on that one funder for their financial management and stability. So ideally, organizations have unrestricted support from multiple organizations to avoid them becoming too dependent. I would like to highlight one more of those nonprofit capacities, and that is mission orientation. That relates to being able to work independently towards the organization's mission, independent of donors, funders, companies, or the government. And unrestricted funding uniquely allows these organizations to work towards the things that they think is most important. Sometimes organizations have a problem that's called mission drift. So as a nonprofit organization, you're continuously seeking funding, and sometimes you adapt your projects and programs to get funding from specific funders. Well, that project or program may not be directly in line with your own mission. That is called mission drift. But if you have unrestricted funding, you can decide yourself where you want to invest that money, how you want to achieve your mission, and how you want to work on it. And that's another reason why it's so really important that we talk about this and that we try to get more organizations unrestricted funding. Let me stop sharing again.
That's great. And yeah, the starvation model, you see it everywhere, right? I think the biggest donor currently the European Commission, they say for all the projects, no more than 7% overhead is allowed. And I don't know of any organization that can run its organization for 7% overhead. And another big donor, like the Ford Foundation, if I remember well, they have as a rule, your minimum should be 25%. And if it's not 25%, they don't believe you can cover your expenses, so your costs. So yeah, so you see two large donors that have a completely different view on this, and where one is a bit more in line with what you were saying, and the other one is a bit more focusing the starvation cycle and probably wants to get most for as little as possible. But
Yeah, I think a big issue here is accountability, because the EU feels they need to be very accountable to the people paying taxes and the European countries.
Yeah.
And so it went to complete other ends than the Ford Foundation did, where they really understand the issues. But
yeah,
Ford is not accountable to the
true.
taxpayers. So that's one of the great benefits of philanthropy, that we can make those decisions and we can do it in probably better ways than public funders can.
True, true. Good point. Good point. Yeah, yeah. So you highlight all the benefits, and it makes so much sense for the recipient, but also for the possible impact for the donor. If it's so crystal clear, how can it still be so rare?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that there is this certain way that funders have been working for a very long time. And the status quo in our sector is project funding. You notice that also when you talk to grantees who receive unrestricted funding, that they really struggle sometimes with understanding what is allowed to do or what is not allowed to do. And then the funders say, but you can do everything you want. But because they've been so conditioned with all their project funding that they cannot do everything they want. So it's a real mind shift that we have to make in order to start incorporating all those benefits of unrestricted funding. So I think the problems or the issues why we don't see it more primarily lay with the funders. They have this really restrictive way of working that has been working for them for a very long time. And we need to change the systems. And we can talk about that a bit later also when we talk about barriers for funders to move towards more unrestricted funding. But I would also say at the same time for fundraising organizations, it is much easier to raise funds for projects, right? It is concrete. People like giving for it. Even if you raise funding from ordinary everyday donors, raising funding for something very concrete, specific, makes people feel good about their giving. They feel they have an impact. They make a change. So as a fundraiser, to raise funding for unrestricted funding for your organization, that is really challenging. And we don't have a lot of great examples of how to do that. And that's what I hope by presenting here today and by the work we've been doing at the Center for Grant Making Research, to give fundraisers some more tools to really start raising that unrestricted funding. And that's also something we will return to later in this webinar.
Oh, good. Yeah. And for the participants, just a quick message, but if you have any questions to Pamela, just leave them in the chat. And we try to address all the questions. And also if you have examples maybe of how you were able to convince a donor that unrestricted funding was really needed for you, I think please put it in the chat if you can, and it will inspire the rest as well. So please use the chat function for this. Looking ahead, so we know where we are today, we know the benefits. What do you think 5 years from now or so, in the near future, what is your forecast? Will the percentage of unrestricted multi-year funding grow in the next couple of years? Will it remain stable? I know the world is changing rapidly, but what do you think?
I really hope it will grow, and that will also show that the work we've been doing at the Center for Grant Making Research has been paying off. But at the same time, I also see how challenging this will be for a lot of funders and grantees to change the way they've been working. And it requires change at all the levels of the organization. So not just at the program management level, but also in the advisory board. So there's a lot of people that need to see the need and the use for this. And there's also quite a bit of misperceptions around it. And maybe we can already address one of those misperceptions around trust-based philanthropy and unrestricted funding. And one of the things I hear back often is that funders feel that unrestricted funding is not strategic. So if you really want to be strategic, you want to have very clear impact measures, or and you want to measure them really regularly, and you want to get that back from the organization in fixed formats. And I really disagree with that. I think if you want to have impact and you want to, so it's different if you just want to build like a little schoolyard with make it more green. Then it's a project, and then it's very logical to have a short-term 1-year project funding, and you have some output measures, the number of trees in that schoolyard or something like that. That makes a lot of sense. But most organizations in the philanthropic sector don't have a mission that is short-term project-based. They have missions that focus on systems change, eradicating poverty, making sure there's no more inequality in the world. If you have those big missions, it is really important to think through how the way you fund will impact those missions. And short-term project funding is not going to cut it. Like if you give a lot of organizations small-time grants, you're not going to eradicate poverty. You're going to put plasters, how we say in Dutch, on some wounds, but you're not going to solve the issue. If you really want to solve an issue and you want to be strategic about it, it is important to think long-term and how you can actually measure change in impact and not just output on the longer term in line with your theory of mission of change. And oftentimes, unrestricted long-term funding is needed to start this movement and to support this movement towards this change system.
Yeah, great. So I think that's very helpful. But looking at the funders and the barriers they have for all of this, well, you mentioned already a few, but what do you think are the biggest barriers on their side to do this?
For the funders, right?
Yes, for the funders, yes.
Yeah, so I think the one that I just talked about is really a big barrier. So they have a lot of concerns around strategy and impact. Yes. And one way around that is to, first of all, if you're a funder, if you select organizations that have a mission that aligns with you, so you both know you're going in the same trajectory, you want to do the same things, and you trust that organization, here the trust-based philanthropy comes in. You already have a relationship with that organization and you know they can deliver the things you're interested in. So that can give a lot of confidence that you can invest in that organization in the long term. And then it's not about just like what Mackenzie Scott does, throw all that money over the fence and do nothing. You should, I think, develop a relationship or build out that relationship with the organization where there is that trust-based relationship, and that both you and the grantee organization will actually dare to say when something is not going well. So you can both solve that. And with the ecosystem in which you're working, you can work on better solutions. So the first concern and barrier that funders really have are around strategy and impact. The second one is about accountability. The one question I get asked so often is the money being spent well if you give unrestricted funding or in trust-based philanthropy? Especially board members or people that feel very responsible for the way the funding is being spent ask those questions. And it's true that unrestricted funding you have less control than with project-based funding. So you have to let go and you have to trust that what is going on over the long run will actually end up being something that is in line with your change and mission. But here you do diligence before you start to work with an organization for the longer term with unrestricted funding, building that relationship, understanding the capacities of the organization, and working together with that organization to see if maybe there are capacities that need to be strengthened in order to succeed, can be very helpful. And one mistake funders sometimes make, and maybe people in the audience have that experience, is that funders decide for the grantees what capacities need to be strengthened without talking to the grantees and just say, okay, you need to develop yourself in that direction, or you need to have more training, you need to hire external impact evaluation team. And I don't think that is very helpful. I think it's very important that we try to have this more equity-based relationship where the grantees are in the driving seat, telling a funder what they need and how they think they can advance the mission. So due diligence is really important. And accountability is still possible, even if you take a long-term vision. And you can have formal and informal evaluations in a trust-based relationship. And it's important, I think, to still have those, but more on an equitable basis where both parties listen to each other. But of course, you will never get rid of this power imbalance where those with the money and those with the funding hold most power. But you can try to mitigate that through those more trust-based approaches. And the final barrier or concern that funders have relates to structural barriers, and these are real. So the systems at funders and grantees are not set up for unrestricted funding. They set up for the status quo project-based funding. So if you want to give unrestricted funding, you need to find a different way to account for it in your own systems. And then sometimes organizations run into issues with people working for those organizations that have been working there for a very long time, have been doing things the way they've been doing it for a very long time, and they may not see the need to change this. And therefore, it's so important that if you, as a funder, but also as a grantee, if you want to change the way you fundraise, you bring along everyone within your organization, and not just the people directly involved, but also the board members, and give people ownership over those changes so that they're part of the change and not just it's put on them, but they can be part in seeing how much better this could actually work. The other issues that are structural barriers are, for example, that when you decide as a funder to shift from smaller project-based funding to longer-term unrestricted funding, you have to make some tough choices because you cannot fund the same number of organizations when you do this. So that is sometimes painful and challenging. And the other thing is, what I want to mention here is that funders can then work together. So maybe if you pool your funds, you can actually achieve more.
Yeah. So if I hear this, so the donors are used to work in a certain way, and they might know because they've read your studies and they've read studies of others that it makes more sense if they changed. We know the NGOs, they would love to get unrestricted funding, but they also work in projects. That's the way many organizations work. They go from project to project. We see that every year when the postcard lottery opens their platform to submit proposals, and then it says, we don't have a framework. You just tell us what you want, how much you need, and why you need us. Those are pretty much the questions they ask. And then many organizations are struggling because they get so much freedom that how to fill this in and how to. So although it makes a lot of sense, it's for both. At the same time, it means that they have to change their way of thinking and way of working completely. And that sounds like a huge challenge, I would.
One book I think is really helpful for this. It's called Modern Grant Making by Gemma Bull and Tom Steinberg. So I can highly recommend that. They have a lot of practical experience in making that change within funders. For grantee organizations, I don't know of a lot of resources, but I think we're going to share something at the end of our session.
Yeah, there's something coming your way. Yeah, so hang in there, and there's some cool stuff coming your way. But that's a good tip indeed, modern grant making, and but this is definitely something fundraisers will recognize, that you need the funding, you see the potential, but you also need to invest in organizing your organization in a different way, and that might conflict with your urgent funding needs. So it's not easy. That's true. So we were talking about the funders. If we look at the fundraising organization, so what can fundraising organizations do to better themselves in getting access to this type of funding?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And maybe you're already doing all those things that I'm now going to say, but these are the steps we thought through that would be really relevant to start to raise more unrestricted funding. And the first step would be to map your own funding portfolio. Oftentimes from academic research, we've learned that diversity of income is really important. So you get income from government grants, you get income from individual donors, from institutional donors, corporate philanthropy, if possible, income from services like fees or products you sell. That's also unrestricted, by the way. So that is the typical advice. Look at that you have enough diversity in your income. But what I want to add to that is also look at the unrestrictedness of those income sources, because just knowing you have enough diversity in your income will not always help you with the issues you encounter. But understanding what part of your income portfolio is unrestricted can really help you, I think. And if you find you don't have any unrestricted income, I think that should be a priority to work towards, to increase at least two, or get to at least two sources of unrestricted income. So because that allows you to be so much more flexible, get that financial stability, all those capacities that I discussed in the model earlier. The next step that I would do if I were a fundraiser at an organization is to engage with people you already know. So, and this is also doing the work for our movement, explaining to the funders you already have a good relationship with, what the importance is of getting more core support for your organization, more flexible, unrestricted funding. And for that, it is important that you know what you want to achieve with that unrestricted funding. So where do you want to use it? How do you want to build specific capacities? Or do you want to make sure you have more financial security? Because a lot of nonprofit organizations cannot survive 3 months in the future with their financial stability. So, and I know it's not a popular thing for funders to give money for reserves, but that is a real issue in our sector, that we have such unstable organizations. So maybe that's not what you want to communicate you want to do to the funder, but I think it's really important. But think about what you can achieve with unrestricted funding that you could not achieve without it, and explain that to the funder. And I'm hopeful, because more and more funders also learn about trust-based philanthropy and unrestricted funding. So if it comes from you, they may listen and think, oh, that really is important, and we need to think about it. And we think that if they think you are a great organization, they should be wanting to support you and help you in the longer run. I would also start with small steps. So we saw this schedule, like this, that unrestricted funding is not a dichotomy, and there's various steps. So rather than just aiming for the holy grail unrestricted funding, you can also try to get unrestricted project-based funding. So just start like with a small step, rather than having a very restricted project. Having more flexible funding for one of your projects can be a first step, also to show the funder that you can manage this, you are reliable, you will deliver. And the final thing I want to say about this, there is a lot of organizations that are receiving unrestricted funding themselves and who are re-granters, but they do not re-grant unrestricted. And I would like to encourage those organizations to think about the way they fund other smaller organizations themselves, and if unrestricted funding, more flexible funding, can have a role in that.
I think that the last comment says a lot. You know, we're so used in project and control, and but even the ones that do get unrestricted funding, they put conditions on their own re-granting. So that's fascinating. But if I hear you well, so it's all about trust between the donor and the recipient. They need to have a joint vision, and they have to come to the conclusion that flexibility is going to contribute to better results, trial, error, experiments, as maybe put some money on your bank account for difficult times, and that will definitely have an impact on the vision that you have. But it also means it will take some time. You know, it's I didn't look at the questions yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if many in the audience have the question like, which donors should we go to for unrestricted funding? And they hope for the far extreme on your on the slide that you showed. No conditions at all, and we can just ask for funding. But even if they exist, it sounds like that it's going to be a challenge if they don't know you and you just apply for funding, right? That relationship needs to be built first. That's the
that's why trust is so important. And you don't have trust in overnight. And funders really need to get to know your organization and you as a person and see that you have those capacities developed to really achieve the things both the funder and you will want to achieve.
Yeah, exactly. So and then maybe instead of focusing on that far extreme ideal scenario, maybe take the step that you were discussing, like focus on more flexible project funding first or program funding and grow from there, because there might be a lot more potential for these organizations in that category because it's closer to both organizations. Okay.
Yeah, and that allows the funders also to experiment with more flexible funding because for them it's often a big step to start doing this, and I also don't think they should change their complete funding strategy from one day to the next. They probably also need to experiment with this and see how that works for their organization, bring the people within the funder organization along. So helping them do that in small steps can also be very helpful.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. All right. Before we open the room for the questions and answers, you already mentioned that we're going to share something with all the participants, and that is going to be this. So there is a handbook on the impact of unrestricted funding that we will share with all of you after this webinar. Tomorrow you get an email with this in it and a link to the recording and the presentation and all. So we will share this with you, and I hope you all like it. But to you, Pamela, as a last question, what do you hope that this handbook will actually spark in the field if we're going to share this message?
Yeah, I hope you will try to experiment with it and try to see how you can fundraise for more unrestricted funding, and through that educate the funders as well.
Great. Educate each other, educate the funders. Yeah, a lot of education is needed, but it's worth it. So it will be in your inbox tomorrow, and we look forward to getting your feedback on it, and hopefully you can use it. With that, I will stop the recording, and then